Y'all know what's going on. It's time for another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Bacon. Welcome to the show, y'all. Grief ain't a visitor. It's a roommate. It moves into the empty spaces of your house, puts its feet up on your furniture, and never ever leaves. For 10 years, Maria had been living with that roommate, and it had taken over everything. Her son, Miguel, was a ghost who lived in photographs. On the mantelpiece, he was smiling in his cap and gown, the whole world in front of him. Taped to the fridge, he was a goofy kid with a missing front tooth holding up a string of fish. Everywhere she looked, there he was. And everywhere she looked, he wasn't. The man who had turned her son into a ghost was a name on a court document. Carlos Reyes. She knew he was in a cage somewhere upstate, and for a long time, that was the only thing that brought her any comfort. She would picture him in a cold, dark cell, suffering, and she would feel a flicker of something that felt like justice. But it never lasted, because his suffering didn't bring her son back. It just added another layer of darkness to a world that was already black. She moved through her life like a sleepwalker. She worked her job at the bakery, her hands moving on autopilot, kneading dough, frosting cakes. Her co-workers were kind, but they kept their distance. They didn't know what to say to the woman whose son had been murdered, so they just said nothing. And their silence was another wall in the prison of her grief. The anger was her shield. It was a fire that kept her warm, kept the crushing weight of the sadness from collapsing her completely. She hated Carlos. She hated the streets that had made him. She hated the gun that had fired the bullet. She hated a God that would let something like this happen. The hate was clean, simple, and all-consuming, but at night, when the house was quiet and the anger was exhausted, the questions would come. They were relentless, a slow, patient torture. Why? Why did he have to go to that store on that night? What were his last thoughts? Did he think of me? Did the boy who killed him even look him in the eye? The trial had given her facts, but no answers. She had sat in that courtroom every day, watching Carlos, a skinny, scared-looking 19-year-old, stare at the floor. He never looked at her, not once. She had wanted to see a monster, but all she saw was a broken boy. And that, in a way, was even more painful. Monsters are easy to hate. Boys are not. 10 years, a decade of empty holidays of birthdays celebrated at a gravesite, a decade of watching Miguel's friends grow up, get married, have kids of their own, living the life that had been stolen from her son. The grief was a constant low-grade fever, sometimes spiking into a full-blown inferno. On the 10th anniversary of his death, the inferno came. She was sitting at her kitchen table, a single candle lit in front of Miguel's picture, and the wave of pain was so immense, so suffocating, she thought it would kill her. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit in this silence anymore. She pulled out a pen and a sheet of paper. Her hands were trembling. She was going to write to him, to Carlos. She didn't know why. She just knew that the silence between them was a void that was swallowing her whole. She had to fill it with something, even if it was just words of hate. She started to write, "To the monster who took my son." The rage came pouring out, a black venomous torrent. She filled the page with curses, with pain, with a decade of unspeakable loss. This wasn't just a letter. It was an exorcism. She was trying to cast out the demon that had taken up residence in her soul. And as she wrote, she had no idea that this single act of desperation was the first step on a journey that would lead her, not to the revenge she thought she wanted, but to a kind of peace she had long ago given up on ever finding. The first letter was a weapon. Maria sharpened every word into a blade, every sentence into a spear. She wrote about the hole he had ripped in her life, a hole so vast and deep that no amount of time could ever fill it. She described in brutal detail the morning she had to identify her son's body at the morgue, The cold, sterile feel of the room, the lifeless weight of his hand in hers. She wanted him to see what she saw. She wanted him to feel what she felt. She wrote for 3 days, the pages piling up a monument to her own rage. When she was finally done, she read it over, her hands shaking, and she felt nothing. The fire was gone, burned out, leaving only a cold gray ash. The letter was a perfect expression of her hatred, but it hadn't healed a thing. It had just given her pain a new shape. She tore it up, the sound of the ripping paper, a small, violent act of release. And she started again. And this time the questions that haunted her at night found their way onto the page. I need to know what happened in that store, she wrote. The paper said it was a robbery. But was it just that? Did you go in there to kill someone? Did my son try to be a hero? Did he fight back? Or was he just a boy in the wrong place at the wrong time? She filled the pages with her need to know, her desperate search for a narrative that made sense. She wrote about Miguel not just as a victim, but as a person. She told Carlos about his dreams of being an engineer, about his terrible jokes about the way he loved his grandmother's cooking. She was trying to make him see the person he had erased. And as she wrote, a new, more difficult set of questions began to emerge. Questions about him. Who are you? She wrote. Where did you come from? Did you have a mother who worried about you? Did you have dreams of your own before they were consumed by whatever darkness led you to my son's store that night? This was the hardest part. To even consider the humanity of the man who had destroyed her life. It felt like a betrayal of her own grief, of her son's memory. But the questions wouldn't go away. The monster in her mind was a simple, easy target for her hate. But the broken boy from the courtroom, he was a far more complicated story. And for the first time, she found herself wanting to read it. She spent a month on that letter. It became a ritual, a form of therapy. Every night, she would sit at her kitchen table and she would write. She was excavating her own heart, digging through the layers of rage and sorrow, searching for a truth that was more complex than simple vengeance. And in that process, the world started to come back into focus. She started to notice the small things again, the taste of her morning coffee, the warmth of the sun on her face, the sound of her neighbor's children laughing in the yard. The grief was still there, a constant companion, but it was no longer the only thing. There was room now, just a little, for something else. When the letter was finally finished, it was a testament to her journey. It was a raw, honest, and profoundly human document. It was not a letter of forgiveness, it was a letter of witness. A mother's final, desperate attempt to understand the incomprehensible, and in doing so, to reclaim her own life from the wreckage. She put it in an envelope, addressed it, and placed it in the box in her closet. It was a silent message in a bottle, cast into a sea of pain, waiting for a tide that might one day bring it to a distant, lonely shore. While Maria was wrestling with her ghosts on the outside, Carlos was wrestling with his own on the inside. The man he was at 29 was a universe away from the scared, angry 19-year-old who had walked into that prison. The first 5 years of his sentence had been a brutal, violent blur. He had learned the hard rules of survival, built a reputation as a man not to be trifled with. But the hardness was a shield, a desperate attempt to protect the small, broken boy who was still trapped inside him. The ghost of Miguel was his constant cellmate. He saw his face in the dark, in the reflection in the polished steel of the chow hall trays. He heard his last words in the quiet moments between the bells and the shouts. The guilt was a physical thing, a sickness that he could never escape. He hit his bottom in solitary confinement. He'd been in a yard fight and they'd thrown him in the hole for a month. In that total suffocating darkness, with nothing but the sound of his own breathing, He was finally forced to confront the truth of what he had done. He had taken a life. He had shattered a family. He was a monster. But in that moment of complete and utter self-loathing, a small, quiet voice inside him whispered, "But you don't have to be." It was the beginning of a long, slow, painful crawl out of the darkness. When he got out of the hole, he was different. He started going to the prison chapel, not because he was religious, but because it was quiet. He started reading devouring books from the prison library. He enrolled in a victim offender reconciliation program, a terrifying step into the heart of his own crime. He sat in a circle with other men like him, men with blood on their hands and ghosts in their eyes, and for the first time, he told his story. The whole ugly, pathetic truth. He talked about the poverty he grew up in, the pull of the streets, the stupid, reckless choices that had led him to that convenience store. He didn't make excuses. He just confessed. And in that confession, he felt a small, fragile seed of something he had thought was lost to him forever. Redemption. He thought about Miguel's mother every day. He knew her face from the trial, the look of pure, unadulterated hatred she had directed at him. He deserved it. He knew that. He wanted to write to her to tell her he was sorry, but he knew that sorry was a useless, pathetic word. It couldn't bring her son back, so he tried to live a life of amends. He became a mentor to the younger inmates, the kids who came in with the same fire and anger he had once had. He shared his story with them not as a boast, but as a warning. He tried to be the man he had needed when he was their age. He had no idea that 100 miles away, that same woman was on her own journey of transformation. He had no idea that a letter with his name on it sat in a box in her closet, and they were two souls bound by a single tragic moment, unknowingly walking parallel paths toward a confrontation that was both terrifying and necessary. 5 years passed. The unopened letter in Maria's closet became a silent monument to a grief that had begun to change. The sharp, jagged edges of her anger had been worn smooth by the slow, patient work of time. The hatred was still there, a low, smoldering ember, but it no longer consumed her. She had started to live again. She had reconnected with her church, found a community of women who understood her loss. She started a small garden in her backyard, finding a quiet, simple joy in the act of nurturing life. She was healing, one slow, painful step at a time, but the letter was always there, a reminder of the unanswered questions of the story that was still unfinished. She knew she couldn't keep it in that box forever. It was a weight, a tether to the past, and she knew deep down that she had to cut it. She saw a flyer for the Victim Offender Reconciliation Program. The same program Carlos was in. The thought of it was a jolt, a terrifying possibility. To sit in a room with him, to face the man who had killed her son. Her first instinct was a visceral no. But the idea wouldn't leave her alone. She had spent 15 years hating a ghost, a monster of her own creation. The letter had been an attempt to give that monster a face, but it was still a one-way conversation. She realized that to be truly free, she had to do the one thing she had been avoiding for all these years. She had to listen. It took her months to make the call, but she did it. The process was slow, careful, mediated. The program facilitators made sure that both she and Carlos were ready for what was about to happen. When they told Carlos that Miguel's mother wanted to meet with him, he was terrified, but he agreed without hesitation. He knew this was a reckoning he had to face. The day of the meeting was a gray, overcast day. Maria drove to the prison, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She walked through the clanging gates, the metal detectors, and down the long, sterile hallways. It was like walking into the heart of her own nightmare. She sat in a small, bare room at a simple wooden table and waited. The door opened, and he walked in. He was older now, his face lined with the hard years of his sentence. But his eyes were not the eyes of the monster she had imagined. They were the eyes of a man who was haunted, broken, and profoundly, deeply sorry. They sat in silence for a long time. The letter, with all its rage and its questions, was still in the box in her closet. But in that moment, she realized she didn't need it. The real conversation was about to begin. Not with a ghost or a monster, but with a man. And in that shared, terrifying, and profoundly human space, she knew with a certainty that was both a comfort and a terror that her life was about to change forever. This has been another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Baker, and I say peace, y'all.